Right. So today we are diving into some pretty choppy waters.
Oh!
Yeah. We're exploring this audio file.
Mm-hmm.
It's called I Told You So,
Okay.
and it's from this channel called Right Wing News.
Right.
And the host is calling himself the voice of reason.
Mm.
And he is fired up.
Really?
Yeah, he's like feeling like all his predictions came true, but nobody was listening to him.
Right.
So he is going off on a lot of stuff.
Like what?
Like censorship and media bias and, globalist agendas.
Wow.
He even throws in some alternative theories about human evolution.
Sounds interesting.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, what really struck me was this deep sense of frustration you hear in this voice, right? Like he is convinced that there are forces out there that are silencing conservative viewpoints
Yeah.
and manipulating the public.
Yeah, he goes after YouTube hard.
Oh, really?
Like he claims that they're deliberately demonetizing conservative channels like his.
Hmm.
And it's just making it harder for him to keep producing content. He even mentions a class action lawsuit that's being filed against YouTube for censorship.
Oh, wow. So this raises some interesting questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is the power that these online platforms wield,
Yeah.
and how do they moderate content?
Right.
Is it true that conservative voices are actually being silenced? Or are they just facing, consequences for violating platform rules?
Right.
It's a very complex issue.
Absolutely.
With no easy answers.
And it gets even more interesting when he starts talking about mainstream media outlets.
Oh, really?
Like he claims that places like CNN and MSNBC are pushing specific agendas
Okay.
and are deliberately distorting the truth.
All right.
And he even references a conversation between Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity where they seem to agree with his assessment.
About the media landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting this distrust of mainstream media is such a growing trend.
Right.
And it just feeds into this whole feeling that there's a hidden truth out there that's being suppressed. Like, how do we navigate this information overload, right?
Right.
And figure out what is really going on?
Yeah, well, so he dives into some specific examples of what he considers to be suppressed information.
Like what?
So first up, he claims that he has been warning about the dangers of military intervention in North Korea for years.
Really?
Yeah.
For years?
Yeah, he's like predicting a disastrous outcome if the U.S. were to attack,
Okay.
potentially even escalating to a nuclear conflict involving China.
Wow.
Yeah.
So his concern is that a conflict in North Korea could just spiral out of control
Right.
and have devastating consequences for the entire region.
Yeah,
It's a grim prediction, but it really highlights the high stakes involved.
absolutely. And then he tackles healthcare.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he contends that the failures of both Democrats and Republicans to pass meaningful healthcare reform is all part of a bigger plan.
Uh-huh.
He believes they're deliberately trying to create a situation where a single-payer system
Right.
becomes the only option.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because it speaks to this deep cynicism about the political process.
Oh, boy.
Like he's essentially saying that the gridlock and the inaction that we see in Washington is a deliberate strategy to manipulate the outcome.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, is there any truth to this, or is it just a way to explain away the complexities of healthcare policy?
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
He veers into alternative theories about human evolution,
Really?
claiming that there's evidence of advanced ancient civilizations
Okay.
that contradict the conventional narrative.
Interesting.
So he mentions megalithic structures and ancient cities with advanced technology, and even suggests that there's evidence of ancient nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow. So this is where he starts to push the boundaries of accepted science.
Right.
It is intriguing to think about alternative histories and the possibility of lost civilizations.
Yeah.
But it's also crucial to approach these claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
Like, what evidence does he offer to support these extraordinary claims?
Well, and he doesn't stop there.
No.
He even claims that human DNA contains traces of an extraterrestrial origin.
Wow.
He points to specific chromosomes as evidence,
Okay.
suggesting that there's something more to our origins than meets the eye.
So that is a very bold claim. I mean, it definitely taps into this fascination with the unknown
Right.
and the possibility of life beyond Earth.
Of course.
But scientifically speaking, is there any credible evidence to support this?
Right.
Or is it just speculation?
So we've got censorship, media bias, globalist agendas,
Yeah.
alien DNA.
Wow.
This deep dive is already living up to its name.
It really is.
But before we get too lost in the weeds here, let's step back for a second.
Okay.
And what's important to note is there's this underlying theme
Yeah.
that connects all these seemingly disparate topics.
What's that?
The host believes that there is a coordinated effort to control information and manipulate the public.
Right.
And he's not just pointing fingers at some vague. He specifically calls out individuals like George Soros
Oh, really?
as funders of this supposed agenda.
Interesting.
He even suggests that movements like Black Lives Matter and the NFL protests
Right.
are being manipulated by these powerful forces.
So this is where the conversation gets really interesting.
Right.
Because he is touching on some deeply divisive issues.
Yeah.
He's essentially saying that these movements, which many see as grassroots efforts for social justice,
Right.
are actually being orchestrated by powerful elites
Yeah.
with ulterior motives.
He argues that liberals are using evolution to dehumanize people and to justify their actions.
Okay.
And he cites an interview with this author named Greg Braden,
Okay.
who claims that evidence challenging conventional understandings of evolution is being deliberately suppressed.
Oh, wow. So he's bringing in this whole idea of scientific suppression
Right.
and the control of information.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is the scientific establishment truly open to alternative theories? Or are there forces working to maintain the status quo?
Exactly. He even brings up the discovery of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans,
Okay.
suggesting that this evidence is being ignored
Right.
or downplayed because it challenges the conventional evolutionary narrative.
Okay.
He uses the example of mummified remains with unexplained DNA
Okay.
to further his point,
Mm-hmm.
claiming this evidence is being swept under the rug by mainstream science.
So this is where it becomes crucial to separate genuine scientific inquiry from speculation and conspiracy theories.
Absolutely.
Challenging established theories is important for scientific progress,
Right.
but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
For sure.
It's essential to look at the methodology and the sources of information when evaluating these alternative theories.
This deep dive is definitely giving us a lot to think about.
Yeah.
What stands out to you so far?
Well, I think it's interesting,
Yeah.
Are there any truth to these claims of censorship and manipulation? Or is this host just really good at weaving a compelling narrative?
It's a good question. Welcome back. So last time we were unpacking some pretty heavy accusations.
Yeah.
Suppressed truths, North Korea healthcare human evolution.
Right.
He paints this picture of powerful forces working behind the scenes, controlling the narrative and manipulating the public.
And he doesn't shy away from naming names.
No, he doesn't.
George Soros
Right.
is a key figure in this supposed plot.
Yeah, it's interesting that he brings up George Soros.
Yeah.
Because he's been a frequent target of these conspiracy theories for decades now.
Right.
Often accused of funding liberal causes
Uh-huh.
and meddling in global affairs.
Yeah, it's almost like he's become this symbol of a
Well-
shadowy elite pulling strings behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But the question is there any evidence to support these claims?
Yeah.
Or is it just speculation and fear-mongering?
Right. He even ties Soros to events in Ukraine, suggesting that he's using the same tactics to create unrest and division in the United States.
Huh.
And he specifically points to Black Lives Matter and the NFL protests as examples of movements being manipulated by Soros and his allies.
So this is a common thread in these conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
right? Like connecting seemingly unrelated events and individuals
Right.
to create this grand narrative of a coordinated plot.
Yeah.
It can be very compelling.
Yeah.
But it's also important to be critical and look for concrete evidence.
Yeah, he's pretty harsh in his criticism of the NFL players protesting,
Oh, really?
essentially calling them idiots
Wow.
who are being used as pawns in a larger game they don't even understand.
So he seems to be arguing that these athletes are unqualified to speak on political issues
Right.
and are being exploited by those with a more sinister agenda. It raises an interesting question, right,
Yeah.
about the role of celebrities and athletes in political discourse.
Right.
Do they have a responsibility to stay out of politics, or do they have a right to use their platform to speak out on issues they care about?
He quotes this commentator named Jason Whitlock, who argues that these athletes are just dabbling in politics without really understanding the complexities of the issues.
Yeah.
Whitlock says getting into political discussions, it's not a part-time job. It's not something you do in your spare time in between other things. It's a full-time job.
Right. So that's an interesting point because it speaks to the challenge of having informed political discourse.
Yeah.
In a world where everyone has a platform and opinions are often formed based on sound bites and social media posts, it
Right.
makes you wonder, how do we encourage more thoughtful and nuanced conversations about these complex issues?
So let's move on to some of his other claims. Remember how he was ranting about the media ignoring important stories?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he claims to have predicted several major developments long before they hit the mainstream news cycle.
Really?
Like, for example, he points to his past commentary on Obamacare,
Okay.
arguing that the failure of both Democrats and Republicans to pass meaningful health care reform was a deliberate setup for a single-payer system.
So he's essentially saying, I told you so.
Right.
Right.
He believes the inability of either party to get health care legislation through, even when they controlled all branches of government,
Right.
is proof that there's this hidden agenda at play.
Yeah.
It makes you think, is he genuinely insightful, or is he just good at retroactively fitting events into his existing narrative?
And speaking of predictions, he claims to have been warning about the dangers of military intervention in North Korea for years.
Right.
And he specifically predicted a catastrophic outcome if the U.S. were to attack, potentially triggering a nuclear exchange and drawing China into the conflict.
So his concern is that such a scenario could lead to devastating consequences, not just for the Korean Peninsula, but for the entire world.
Yeah,
This is sobering thought,
it is.
and it highlights the importance of diplomacy and careful consideration when dealing with such volatile situations.
He even goes as far as to suggest that Trump's impeachment were to happen would be part of a larger plan by the shadowy forces to destabilize the country and seize power. It's a pretty bold claim.
And it definitely feeds into this narrative of a deep state working against the will of the people.
It's interesting how he ties this back to his broader argument about a coordinated effort to control the narrative and manipulate the public.
Right.
He sees these events not as isolated incidents, but as part of this larger pattern of manipulation and control.
He also expresses concern about the upcoming elections, suggesting they could be rigged or manipulated.
Okay.
He seems particularly worried about the influence of George Soros and other wealthy donors on the political process.
So this taps into a deep-seated fear of hidden power and influence in our political system.
Yeah.
It's a concern that many people share, regardless of their political affiliation.
Right.
Like, how much influence do wealthy donors have on our elections? And is there a way to ensure that everyone's vote counts equally?
He even criticizes his fellow conservatives,
Oh, really?
saying they're too passive and unwilling to fight back against the forces that are eroding American values. And he uses the example of the Common Core education standards, arguing that conservatives failed to effectively oppose their implementation.
So this suggests a growing sense of frustration and disillusionment within the conservative movement.
Yeah.
He seems to be saying that the traditional avenues of political engagement are no longer effective.
Right.
And that more drastic measures are needed to combat these perceived threats.
He's clearly feeling disillusioned with both sides of the political spectrum,
Yeah.
seeing them as either complicit or incompetent in the face of these existential threats.
It's a pretty bleak outlook for sure.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand where this sentiment is coming from.
Right. This sense of despair and powerlessness is a common theme in conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And it can be very appealing to people who are feeling lost and disillusioned.
Right. It offers a simple explanation for complex problems.
Right.
And it creates a sense of urgency and purpose.
But he's not just complaining about the state of the world, though.
Okay.
He's actively trying to recruit others to his cause. He urges listeners to support alternative media outlets like his own and to wake up to the supposed truths that are being suppressed.
So this call to action is a crucial element of conspiracy theories, right?
Yep.
It's not just about believing in a particular narrative.
Right.
It's about taking action to expose the supposed truth and fight back against the perceived threat.
He even reveals that he's gone tens of thousands of dollars into debt trying to keep his channel afloat,
Really?
suggesting that he's making a personal sacrifice to bring these truths to light.
Wow.
And he pleads with listeners to donate to his cause, arguing that it's their civic duty to support independent media sources.
So this appeal to financial support is a common tactic used by those promoting fringe theories, right?
Right.
It creates a sense of urgency and obligation,
Yeah.
implying that failure to contribute will have dire consequences.
He's clearly framing this as a battle for the soul of America, a fight against powerful forces that are trying to silence dissent and control the flow of information.
So this narrative of being a lone voice of truth fighting against a corrupt establishment,
Right.
It's very powerful.
It is.
And it resonates with people who feel marginalized and unheard.
And he ends the audio on a rather ominous note,
Oh.
suggesting that if people don't wake up soon, it may be too late to save the country from these insidious forces.
So it's a classic cliffhanger, right?
Yeah.
Leaving listeners with a sense of urgency and a desire to learn more.
Yeah.
It's a very effective rhetorical technique.
Right.
Because it taps into people's fears and anxieties.
Yeah.
Creating a sense that something must be done to avert disaster.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From censorship and media bias to shadowy figures manipulating world events.
Right.
It's a lot to take in,
Yeah.
and it's important to step back and analyze what we've heard.
In the final part, we'll do just that.
Okay.
We'll examine the host's claims more critically, considering the evidence, the potential biases, and the broader implications of his worldview. We'll also discuss strategies for navigating the complexities of the information age and forming our own informed conclusions.
Okay, so we've spent this whole deep dive unpacking some pretty intense claims,
Yeah.
hidden agendas,
Right.
media manipulation,
Yeah.
alternative theories about human history.
It's a lot.
It's easy to get swept up in the passion and conviction of this voice of reason, but now it's time to, put on our critical thinking caps.
Right. Like, we've been handed this jigsaw puzzle with some pieces missing.
Yeah.
And others that might not even belong.
Right.
We need to sort through these claims, examine the evidence, and see if we can make sense of the bigger picture.
Exactly. He throws out a lot of accusations, especially about censorship of conservative viewpoints online.
Right.
He uses his own experience with YouTube demonetization as an example.
Yeah.
But is there enough evidence to suggest a systematic effort to silence conservatives on these platforms?
Well, that's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
We have to be careful not to confuse correlation with causation. Just because a conservative channel gets demonetized doesn't automatically mean it's because of their political views.
Right.
Platforms have community guidelines.
Yeah.
And sometimes content, regardless of its political leaning, might violate those guidelines.
He also goes after mainstream media outlets,
Uh-huh.
claiming that they push agendas and distort the truth.
Right.
It's a common sentiment.
It is.
But is there more to it than just a difference in perspective?
Right.
How do we differentiate between legitimate criticism of media bias
Yeah.
and outright conspiracy theories?
I mean, it's a valid point that media outlets, like any institution, can have biases.
Sure.
But to claim a coordinated effort to control the entire narrative is a huge leap.
Yeah.
We need to ask ourselves, what would be the motive for such a massive undertaking?
Right.
And is there any concrete evidence to support this claim?
And what about his claim that both Democrats and Republicans are intentionally failing to pass meaningful healthcare reform?
Right.
He suggests that they're setting the stage for a single-payer system.
Uh-huh.
But isn't that a rather cynical view of the political process?
Well, you have to remember passing major legislation, especially as something as complex as healthcare reform, is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
To suggest that both parties are deliberately sabotaging the process to achieve some hidden goal seems like a stretch.
Yeah.
It's important to consider other factors like the complexities of the issue itself,
Right?
the different ideologies within each party,
Yeah.
and the influence of lobbyists and special interest groups.
Let's not forget his foray into alternative theories about human evolution.
Oh, yeah.
Ancient nuclear weapons, extraterrestrial DNA. It's fascinating stuff.
It is.
But should we take it at face value?
It's important to remember that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
While it's healthy to question established narratives,
Sure.
we should also be wary of accepting alternative theories without solid evidence.
Of course.
Are the sources credible?
Right?
Is the methodology sound?
Yeah.
Has the theory been peer-reviewed by other experts in the field?
He even predicts major events like a conflict with North Korea and potential election rigging. Should we be concerned, or are these just scare tactics?
Well, predicting the future is notoriously difficult.
Yeah.
While it's important to be aware of potential risks and challenges,
Right.
we shouldn't let fear and speculation cloud our judgment.
Right.
Instead, we should focus on understanding the complexities of these issues
Yeah.
and engaging in constructive dialogue about how to address them.
So where does this leave us?
Well,
We've heard a lot of alarming claims, some more plausible than others.
yeah.
What are we supposed to make of it all?
I think the key takeaway here is the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
We live in an age of information overload,
Right.
where anyone can publish anything online.
Right.
It's up to us to be discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
We need to evaluate sources, consider biases, and separate fact from fiction.
It's almost like a mental workout.
It is.
Right. We have to flex those critical thinking muscles to avoid getting swept away by a compelling narrative,
Right.
no matter how passionately it's presented.
Exactly. It's not about dismissing everything that challenges the mainstream narrative,
Right.
but rather approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism
Sure.
and a willingness to dig deeper.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what evidence supports this claim?
Right.
Are there other possible explanations?
Yeah.
What are the potential biases of the source?
So this deep dive has been a wild ride
Yes.
through a landscape of conspiracy theories, alternative narratives, and genuine concerns.
It really has.
It's a reminder that the truth is often complex and nuanced,
Yeah.
and it takes effort to sift through the noise and find it.
And remember, this is just a starting point.
Right.
It's up to each of us to continue exploring these topics,
Right.
seeking out reliable sources and forming our own informed conclusions.
This has been an incredible exercise in critical thinking,
Yes.
and I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
Me too.
Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.